Most people know midway through the dive bombers. The 5 minutes on the morning of June 4th, 1942, when American aircraft found 4 Japanese carriers with their flight decks crowded with rearming planes, and sank all 4 before the fighters got airborne. 3,000 Japanese dead. The Pacific War altered in a morning. You probably don't know the name Joseph Rochefort. Here's why that matters. Without the work Rochefort did in a basement at Pearl Harbor in the spring of '42, Nimitz doesn't know those carriers are coming. He positions his fleet to defend Hawaii. The Japanese arrive at Midway to find open water and no ambush. The battle you know as the turning point of the Pacific War becomes something else entirely. Rochefort was removed from command 4 months after Midway. The Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz recommended for him was blocked in Washington by the men who had told Nimitz he was wrong. The actual medal arrived in 1985. Rochefort had died 9 years before. This is not the story of the battle. It's the story of what happens when one man is right about something that matters, and what his institution does to him for it. If this is the kind of history you've never heard, share it with someone who should have. These are the people who disappear from the record. The basement of the administration building at Pearl Harbor was cold enough that Rochefort kept a red smoking jacket at the office. He'd stopped worrying about how it looked. By the spring of '42, he'd stopped worrying about most things that weren't the code. The Combat Intelligence Unit, Station Hypo in the Navy's designation, occupied a space that had originally been used for storage. Fluorescent lights, no windows, the low, persistent hum of machines processing intercepts around the clock. The men who worked there ran on coffee and whatever sleep they could manage between shifts, which in the critical weeks of April and May amounted to almost nothing. Rochefort himself hadn't left the building for days at a stretch. He wore the smoking jacket because the basement was cold, and because nobody who mattered was watching, and the slippers because standing on concrete for 16 hours is easier in slippers than in standard naval footwear. He ran his unit like a craftsman runs a workshop, exacting standards, no patience for bureaucratic performance. The work was the only thing that counted down here. The Japanese Naval Operational Code was called JN-25. It had been in use since before the war, modified at irregular intervals, and it was not broken in the clean way the word implies. What Hypo had was fragments, months of intercepted traffic, partially decoded, large sections still opaque. The code's numerical groups were recoverable in places. The patterns in the recovered sections allowed inference about the sections that weren't. A skilled analyst could read Japanese naval intentions the way a surgeon reads a partially obscured scan. Not everything visible, but enough to form a diagnosis. Rochefort was skilled in a specific way. He had spent 3 years in Tokyo in the 1930s, living in the country, studying Japanese, not just the language, but the way its speakers thought. When he sat with an intercept, he wasn't translating, he was reconstructing, reverse engineering intent from the fragments of form. This is a different skill from knowing grammar. It takes years to build, and it cannot be delegated. By the middle of May, the fragments kept producing the same thing. 2 letters, A-F. They appeared in traffic surrounding a Japanese operation designated M-I in the code designators Hypo had assembled over months of intercepts. The operation was clearly large. The order of battle implied in surrounding messages pointed to multiple carriers, battleships, a support fleet, a force assembled for something significant. AF was the target. Whatever AF was, the Japanese intended to take it, hold it, supply it. Washington's official position, held by OP-20G, the Navy's cryptanalysis office run by Captain John Redman and his brother, Commander Joseph Redman, was that AF likely meant Hawaii, possibly the West Coast. Japan needed to extend its defensive perimeter. Hawaii was the prize Pearl Harbor had failed to deliver. Strategically, it made sense, and the Redmans presented it with the confidence of men who believed they were running the conversation. Rochefort believed it was Midway. The designation appeared in traffic patterns consistent with the Central Pacific. The logistics requirements in surrounding messages, supply quantities, water provisions, the scale of the landing force, matched a small island of limited resources. Midway sat at the western end of the Hawaiian chain, exposed, strategically significant, a persistent irritant to Japanese operational planning since December of '41. The problem was simple and immovable. Believing and knowing are different things. Rochefort had belief, accumulated, rigorous, professionally grounded belief, built from months of reading traffic that nobody else in the Pacific had read as carefully as he had. What he didn't have was proof, something Washington could not argue with, something concrete enough that even men who wanted him to be wrong would be forced to stop saying it. He sat in the basement. He went back to the intercepts, because there had to be a way to produce the proof, a specific mechanism he and his closest ally, Commander Edwin Layton, had been discussing in quiet conversations over the past several days. A way to make the Japanese tell him, in their own encrypted words, exactly what AF meant. The mechanism he was considering was either going to make the argument impossible to dismiss, or it was going to give Washington exactly what they needed to remove him. Washington in the spring of '42 looked nothing like a basement. OP-20G occupied proper offices in the Navy Department building on Constitution Avenue. Carpets, windows, natural light. The men who worked there wore their uniforms correctly, attended meetings on schedule, and had direct access to Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the entire United States fleet, through channels that Pearl Harbor, 2,000 miles away, could not match. Captain John Redman and his brother Commander Joseph Redman were not fools. This is worth saying clearly, because what comes next is easy to misread as a story about incompetence, and it isn't. Their analysis of JN-25 traffic was professionally conducted. Their conclusion? That AF referred to Hawaii, or possibly the West Coast, was defensible given the intercepts they were working from. Japan had tried for Pearl Harbor once and failed to finish the job. A second strike at the Hawaiian chain made strategic sense. The Redmans built a case for it that was coherent, presented it with confidence, and believed it. What they did next is the part that mattered. They didn't simply disagree with Hypo's assessment. They worked to ensure that Hypo's assessment never reached Nimitz with the same institutional weight as their own. Washington controlled the formal intelligence reporting channels. Washington had King's ear. Washington had rank. And Washington had a very specific problem with the unit in the basement at Pearl Harbor. It was producing analysis that contradicted theirs, and it was doing it from a position they couldn't directly control. Rochefort, from their perspective, was a technical asset operating outside the institutional framework that was supposed to govern these things. His unit reported to Nimitz's staff rather than through Washington's chain. He had opinions that differed from theirs and allies, particularly Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's fleet intelligence officer, who had the proximity to the admiral that the Redmans lacked. Proximity in intelligence work is everything. The man in the room carries more weight than the man on the teletype, regardless of rank. Layton understood this better than anyone. He had known Rochefort since the 1930s, when they'd both been stationed in Tokyo, both learning Japanese, both beginning to understand that the country they were studying was preparing for something that the institutional Navy hadn't yet fully reckoned with. According to Layton's memoir, "And I Was There," published in 1985, the relationship between the two men was built on a shared professional instinct, a sense that the important questions in intelligence were never the ones the institutions thought to ask. Layton served as the bridge between the basement and Nimitz's office. Each morning he took Rochefort's overnight work, the intercept analysis, the traffic patterns, the accumulating picture of what the Japanese were planning and where, and translated it into the kind of briefing that an admiral could act on. He was not simply a courier. He was an interpreter of what the basement was saying, and he believed in what the basement was saying in the specific way that makes a man willing to stake his professional reputation on it. This arrangement made the Redmans extremely uncomfortable, because what it meant, in practice, was that Nimitz was receiving two separate intelligence assessments from two separate institutional sources with two separate conclusions, and that the one coming from outside Washington's formal framework had the advantage of being delivered in person, every morning, by a man Nimitz trusted. Washington countered the only way institutions know how, with paperwork, with formal objections, with arguments about authority and process, and the proper chain of cryptanalytic reporting. The Redmans pushed for OP-20G to control the final intelligence product that reached fleet commanders. They questioned Hypo's methods. They questioned Rochefort's conclusions. They did this without the intercepts Rochefort was working from, without the months of accumulated pattern recognition that lived in the basement, without the 3 years in Tokyo that shaped how he read a Japanese sentence. They had rank and they had access. That was their argument. Here is the thing about institutional intelligence failures that almost never makes it into the histories. They rarely happen because people are stupid. They happen because organizations are designed to produce consensus, and consensus rewards the people who control the process rather than the people who understand the problem. Washington's entire intelligence framework was built around a single question: where are their assets? How many carriers? How many planes? What is the range of their strike package? It was the language of order of battle, precise, quantifiable, professionally satisfying. It was also the wrong question. Rochefort wasn't asking where Japanese assets were. He was asking where they were going, not an inventory, an intention. The difference sounds subtle. It wasn't. An answer to the wrong question, delivered with perfect precision, sends your carriers to defend Hawaii, while the Japanese fleet is already 2 days out from Midway. An answer to the right question, uncertain and argued over, and arrived at in a cold basement by a man in a smoking jacket who hadn't slept properly in 3 weeks, puts your carriers exactly where they need to be. Rochefort had the right question. He believed he had the right answer. What he didn't have, what the entire argument between Pearl Harbor and Washington reduced to in the end, was proof that Washington could not dispute. He had been working on that problem for days, and in the last week of May, he and Layton arrived at something that was either the neatest piece of intelligence work produced in the Pacific War, or a gamble that would end both their careers. The idea was simple enough to fit on a single page. Simple enough, in fact, that when Rochefort and Layton first discussed it, the simplicity itself was nearly disqualifying. Intelligence operations of consequence were supposed to be complicated. What they were proposing wasn't complicated at all. They would ask Midway to lie. The mechanics were these. Midway would transmit a plain text radio message, unencrypted, open, fully readable to anyone listening, reporting that the island's water distillation plant had broken down. Fresh water supplies were critically low. They needed resupply. The message would go out on a frequency the Japanese monitored. It would be phrased as routine operational traffic. It would be entirely false. Then they would wait. If AF was Midway, if Rochefort's months of accumulated reading were correct, the Japanese intelligence network monitoring that frequency would pick up the message, assess it as genuine, and report it up through their own chain. That report would travel in encrypted traffic, JN25. The same code, HYPO, had been reading in fragments for months. And somewhere in that encrypted traffic, if the Gambit worked, would be a Japanese intelligence officer reporting what he had just learned about a target location his Navy was preparing to attack. He would use the designation his Navy used. He would write AF. Rochefort explained this to Layton. Layton understood immediately. The beauty of the mechanism was that it didn't require breaking more of the code. It required the Japanese to decode it for them, in their own words, in their own encrypted traffic, on their own schedule. The risk was simpler still. If the Gambit failed to produce a response, it meant nothing. If it produced a response referring to a different location, Rochefort was wrong, Washington was right, and he had spent whatever remained of his professional credibility on a trick that proved the trick was all he had. He authorized the message. Midway transmitted on a Tuesday in late May. Rochefort went back to work and tried not to think about it. This is harder than it sounds. He had been inside this problem for months. The code designators, the traffic patterns, the accumulated inference that pointed toward AF as Midway, all of it lived in him now, the way a language lives in someone who has spoken it long enough that they stop translating. He didn't analyze the intercepts anymore so much as read them in the same way you read a face. The conclusion he'd arrived at felt less like a deduction than a certainty, the kind that sits in your chest rather than your head, that you know before you know why you know it. But certainty in your chest is not evidence on a page. He knew what the basement knew. He needed the Japanese to say it. The fluorescent lights hummed, the machines ran, men came in and went out and came back in. The coffee was always on. He waited. 2 days later, a Japanese intelligence report appeared in intercepted traffic. It was processed through the normal channels. Incoming intercept, logged, routed to the analysts. One of Rochefort's men brought it to him, a fragment, partially decoded, consistent with the operational traffic surrounding the MI designator. A report from a Japanese intelligence unit monitoring the Central Pacific. Rochefort read it. AF is short of water. 5 words. The fragment was brief, the surrounding context partially obscured, but the core of it was intact and unambiguous. The Japanese intelligence network had received Midway's fake report about the water distillation plant, assessed it as genuine, and filed it as relevant operational intelligence about their target. Their target, which they called AF. Rochefort read the line again. He put the paper down on the desk and sat very still for a moment, in the way a person sits when something they have been carrying for a long time has just been confirmed, and the confirmation is exactly what they needed, and they haven't yet figured out what to do with the feeling. According to Layton's memoir, And I Was There, Rochefort's response when Layton arrived was characteristic. He showed him the intercept, said something brief about the confirmation, and immediately moved to what came next. What came next was getting this to Nimitz. What came next was the argument, because Washington was still in it, still maintained their position, and a single intercepted fragment, however conclusive it appeared, was not going to end that argument on its own. He was right. He brought the intercept to Layton. Layton took it to Nimitz's office. Washington's response, when the AF intercept and its implications were forwarded through official channels, was not a concession. The Redmans acknowledged the intercept. They offered an alternate reading. The message could refer to a false report planted by American intelligence, which is exactly what it was, meaning it proved nothing about the actual target. A circular argument, technically defensible, institutionally useful. Rochefort sat in the basement and read this response. He had handed Washington the proof. Washington had picked it up, turned it over, found the one interpretation that preserved their position, and handed it back. The intercept said, AF is short of water. Hypo said, Midway's water plant had broken down. The conclusion was there in plain language, in the enemy's own words, in their own encrypted traffic. And the men in proper offices on Constitution Avenue, with natural light and carpets and direct access to Admiral King, were telling Nimitz that this meant nothing definitive. Layton, according to his memoir, was furious in the measured way of men who have trained themselves not to show it. He brought the case back to Nimitz. He laid out the full picture, the traffic patterns, the logistics analysis, the AF intercept, the specific mechanism that had produced it, and made the argument one more time, as clearly as he could make it. Nimitz listened to all of it. Then he asked a question that, according to Layton, was characteristically direct. He asked, "Are you confident?" Layton said yes. Nimitz said he would think about it. What he was actually thinking about was not the intelligence. He had made up his mind about the intelligence. What he was thinking about was a coordinate northeast of Midway, 300 miles out, where 2 carrier task forces could wait unseen for a Japanese fleet that would arrive believing they had the element of surprise. He was thinking about point luck, and about what it would cost if Rochefort was wrong. Chester Nimitz made decisions the way a good surgeon operates, quietly, without drama, with the specific stillness of someone who has already done the hard thinking before entering the room. He was not a man who performed certainty. The officers around him often noted that you couldn't tell, watching him work, whether he was confident or simply committed. The distinction mattered to Nimitz. He understood, in the way that people who carry real weight understand, that confidence is a feeling and commitment is a choice, and that when the situation is genuinely uncertain, only one of those two things is honest. In the last days of May 1942, the situation was genuinely uncertain. He had Rochefort's assessment on one side, the intercept, the AF Gambit, the months of accumulated traffic analysis that Layton had been translating into morning briefings for weeks. And he had Layton himself, a man he trusted, presenting a case he had read carefully, vouching for a conclusion he believed. On the other side, he had Washington. Washington had the formal position of OP-20G, Captain John Redman's analysis, Hawaii, or possibly the West Coast, delivered through proper channels, backed by institutional authority, and held with the particular firmness of men who understood that being overruled publicly is a thing that damages careers. Admiral King had not directly intervened, but his office was downstream of everything the Redmans were producing, and King's institutional weight was present in every communication from Washington, even when King himself wasn't. To override Washington was not a simple act. Nimitz commanded the Pacific Fleet, but he operated within a chain that ran through King and up to the Joint Chiefs. Positioning his entire remaining carrier force at a single coordinate in the Central Pacific, on the basis of an intelligence assessment that Washington officially disputed, meant taking personal ownership of a decision that had no institutional cover. If it was wrong, if the Japanese fleet appeared off Hawaii while his carriers were waiting 300 miles northeast of Midway, the damage to the Pacific position would be severe, and the question of who had made that call would have a single, clear answer. He sat with this. According to Layton's memoir, And I Was There, the conversations between Layton and Nimitz during this period had a specific quality. Nimitz asked questions rather than stated positions. He went back to the same details more than once, not because he hadn't understood them, but because he was testing them, turning them over, looking for the place where the case developed a crack he hadn't seen before. He kept returning to the AF intercept. The Redman's counter-reading, that the intercept proved nothing because the water shortage was a planted report, was technically coherent. Layton acknowledged this to Nimitz directly. Yes, it was a planted report. That was the point. Hypo had planted it. The Japanese had received it, assessed it as genuine, and reported it using their own designation for the target they were about to attack. The designation was AF. Hypo said AF was Midway. Nimitz considered this for a long moment. Then he said something that Layton recorded almost as an aside, a detail he returned to near the end of And I Was There, because he felt it explained everything that followed. Nimitz said, roughly, that the question wasn't whether Rochefort was right. He thought Rochefort was right. The question was whether he trusted his own reading of the man enough to act on it when every formal signal in his chain of command was pointing the other direction. He said this wasn't an intelligence decision. It was a trust decision. What Nimitz understood about trust was specific and institutional, and arrived at through years of watching organizations produce bad outcomes for structural reasons. An intelligence assessment travels through people before it reaches a decision maker. By the time it arrives, it has been filtered through the analysts who wrote it, the officers who reviewed it, the channels that transmitted it, and the institutional interests of everyone in the chain who had a stake in what the decision maker decided. The further the assessment traveled from its source, the more each of those filters had worked on it. What arrived on Nimitz's desk from Washington had passed through a chain optimized to produce consensus. And consensus, in an intelligence dispute, Nimitz knew, reliably favors the side with more institutional leverage. Layton's morning briefings were different. They came from one floor below, from a man who had read the raw traffic himself, worked with Rochefort directly, and was presenting not a filtered consensus, but an argued position. They arrived with the texture of something still unresolved, still being fought over, not yet smoothed into the language of formal certainty. That texture was, paradoxically, what made them credible. Nimitz made his decision. Task Force 16, under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Task Force 17, under Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher, would proceed to a coordinate 300 miles northeast of Midway. The coordinate had a name, Point Luck. Nimitz chose it himself, according to Layton, the name, not just the position. Whether this was dry humor or genuine acknowledgement of what the operation depended on, Layton didn't say. Both interpretations fit the man. The carriers left Pearl Harbor on May 28th and 31st. Enterprise and Hornet with Spruance. Yorktown, damaged at Coral Sea, patched together in 72 hours by repair crews working without sleep, with Fletcher. 3 carriers, Nimitz's entire operational carrier force in the Pacific, committed to a single ambush position based on one commander's reading of broken code. Washington was not informed of the specific positioning in advance. Nimitz sent a brief message to his task force commanders that Layton later described as characteristic in its economy. He told them where to go. He told them when to be there. He told them the Japanese would arrive from the northwest on approximately June 4th. He did not tell them how he knew. In the basement at Pearl Harbor, Rochefort received word that the fleet had moved. He went back to work. The intercepts were still coming in. The picture of Operation MI was filling in further. The scale of the Japanese force, the timeline, the order of approach. Each new fragment confirmed what Hypo had argued for weeks. Each confirmation arrived quietly. One more data point in a case that was already built, that the carriers were already sailing on, that Washington still officially disputed. Rochefort read the overnight traffic and made notes and drank coffee in the cold basement and thought about June 4th. The battle would happen 2,000 miles from where the decision had been made. He would not see it. He would hear it, the way you hear something from very far away, in pieces, arriving out of sequence, each piece requiring interpretation before it produced meaning. but the meaning had already been decided. Somewhere northeast of Midway, 3 carrier task forces were sitting in open ocean, waiting for a Japanese fleet that believed it had the element of surprise. What happened next would tell him whether he'd read the code correctly, or whether he'd read his own certainty and mistaken it for the code. He turned back to the intercepts. June 4th was 4 days away. The first reports reached Pearl Harbor in fragments. This is how Rochefort experienced the battle he had made possible, not as a sequence of events, but as pieces of radio traffic arriving out of order in a cold basement 2,000 miles from the Philippine Sea. A contact report, an attack underway, unconfirmed claims of hits, silence. Then more traffic, overlapping, contradictory in the way that all combat reporting is contradictory before anyone has time to compare notes and establish what actually happened. He read each piece as it came in and put it down and waited for the next one. At roughly 10:22 in the morning, local time at Midway, American dive bombers found 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu. All 3 had their flight decks crowded with aircraft, being rearmed and refueled, a consequence of the Japanese command decision to rearm their strike package for a second attack on Midway, rather than launching immediately against the American fleet. The bombers came down from altitude in the space of approximately 5 minutes. The flight decks, loaded with fuel and ordnance, did the rest. All 3 ships were mortally hit before their fighters could get airborne. 3 carriers, 5 minutes, a trap that had been set in a basement 3 weeks before the ships left port. Hiryu survived the morning and launched her own strike, which found Yorktown and damaged her badly enough that she couldn't continue. That afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu and put her under 2. She sank the following morning. 4 carriers, the entire Japanese carrier striking force that had opened the Pacific War at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 41. Gone in a single afternoon. Approximately 3,000 Japanese dead. The news arrived at Pearl Harbor the way important news always arrives in wartime, simultaneously too much and not enough. Confirmed kills contradicted by uncertain reports. Yorktown's status unclear for hours. The scope of what had happened not immediately visible in the fragments, requiring assembly, requiring someone to lay all the pieces together and read the shape they made. Rochefort read the shape. He had spent months reading intention from fragments. This was the same skill applied to outcome rather than plan, and the outcome, assembled from the fragmentary traffic coming in across the course of June 4th and into June 5th, was the one he had been working toward since April. The ambush had worked. The fleet had been exactly where he said it would be. The carriers had been waiting at Point Luck when the Japanese arrived. And the Japanese had arrived believing they had surprise. And the surprise had run entirely the other direction. According to Layton's memoir, And I Was There, Rochefort's reaction to the confirmation was not what the moment might seem to call for. There was no celebration in the basement, no formal acknowledgement, no gathering of the unit, no speech. Rochefort received the confirmed reports, said something brief to Layton, and went back to work. The intercepts were still coming in. The battle wasn't over. There was still traffic to read, still a picture to assemble, still work that only the people in this basement were positioned to do. This was characteristic. And it was also, in a way Rochefort probably didn't examine at the time, exactly right. Because the basement had done its job. The carriers had been positioned. The ambush had worked. The 4 months of 18-hour days in cold fluorescent light, the fragments assembled into inference, the argument made and disputed and made again. All of it had produced the result it was supposed to produce. That was the job. The job was done. What you feel, standing in the place where the decision was made, when the decision turns out to be correct, it isn't triumph. It's something quieter and less comfortable. The specific relief of a man who has been right alone for a long time and can now, finally, stop being the only one who knows it. The battle continued for several days. Yorktown was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine on June 6th, while under tow, and sank the following morning. The destroyer Hammond, alongside her, went down in the same attack. More men dead on the American side added to the accounting. Rochefort tracked all of it from the basement. On the surface, in Nimitz's office, in the official communications, traveling back and forth between Pearl Harbor and Washington, something else was beginning that Rochefort hadn't turned his attention to yet. The battle had been a success. Someone was going to receive credit for it. The question of who that would be and how that question would be resolved was already being asked in offices that had windows and carpets and direct access to Admiral King. The basement didn't hear these conversations. That was by design. Nimitz sent a message to his task force commanders after the battle that Layton described as the most economical summary of a major naval engagement he had ever read. Nimitz noted what had been accomplished, named the losses, and said almost nothing about how the ambush had been made possible. The full accounting of that, of the basement, the smoking jacket, the red thread of inference running from a cold room at Pearl Harbor to 4 burning carriers in the Pacific, would be classified for years. Rochefort's unit operated under secrecy requirements so strict that the men inside it couldn't tell their families where they worked or what they did. The intelligence victory at Midway could not be publicly attributed without revealing that JN-25 had been broken, which would tell the Japanese to change their code. Secrecy is a reasonable operational requirement. It is also, as Rochefort would discover in the 4 months that followed, extraordinarily convenient for the people who want to write the history before the classification is lifted. In October of 1942, 4 months after Midway, the Navy reassigned Joseph Rochefort to command a floating dry dock. Not a ship, not a station, a floating dry dock, a maintenance facility for repairing vessels, anchored in harbor, going nowhere. A job that required none of the skills he had spent 20 years developing, in a role that had no relationship to intelligence, cryptanalysis, or anything else he knew how to do. He was given this assignment by an institution he had just handed the most consequential intelligence victory of the Pacific War. He accepted the orders. What else do you do? The mechanism of his removal was institutional in the specific way that institutional removals always are. Not a single decision, not a confrontation, but an accumulation of paperwork moving through channels he couldn't fully see. Washington reorganized the Navy's cryptanalytic structure in the fall of '42, bringing the fleet's intelligence units under tighter central control. OP-20G would coordinate the analysis. The Combat Intelligence Unit at Pearl Harbor, Station HYPO, the basement, everything Rochefort had built would be absorbed into the new structure under different leadership. The Redmans had been arguing for exactly this arrangement since before Midway. Now, with the battle over and the classified details of the intelligence picture still locked away from public view, they made the argument again, and it held. Nimitz objected. According to Layton's memoir, And I Was There, he objected formally and specifically, detailing what Hypo had produced and what Rochefort's leadership had contributed to the outcome at Midway. He recommended Rochefort for the Distinguished Service Medal. He put the recommendation in writing and sent it through proper channels. Washington blocked it. The recommendation was reviewed, processed, and declined. No medal, no formal recognition. The man who had planted the AF Gambit assembled 4 months of intercept analysis into a conclusion that Nimitz had trusted over his own chain of command and been proven correct when 4 Japanese carriers went to the bottom of the Pacific. That man was handed orders to a floating dry dock and thanked in the way institutions thank people they have finished with, by being ignored. The Redmans were promoted. This is documented. Not rumor, not inference, documented. The men who had disputed Rochefort's assessment lobbied to override his unit's authority, offered an alternate reading of the AF intercept that preserved their institutional position after the Gambit had already proven them wrong. Those men received promotions after Midway. The institutional machinery that should have been embarrassed by what happened instead processed the outcome through the framework it was designed to protect, and the framework protected the people inside it. This is not unusual. It is what frameworks do. Rochefort served out the war in roles that had nothing to do with intelligence. He was eventually given command of a dry dock facility on the West Coast. He did the work. He was professional about it. He did not, in any account left behind, spend much time talking about what had happened. Edwin Layton, who had been the bridge between the basement and Nimitz's office, who had made the case to the Admiral every morning for weeks and staked his own credibility on Rochefort being right. Layton stayed in intelligence, stayed close to Nimitz, and spent the post-war decades quietly furious about what had been done to his friend. According to And I Was There, the book he published in 1985, the injustice of Rochefort's removal never stopped bothering him. He wrote about it with the specific anger of a man who had watched something wrong happen in real time and been unable to stop it. He published the book the year the medal finally arrived. The Distinguished Service Medal that Nimitz had recommended in 1942 was awarded posthumously in 1985. President Reagan signed the citation. Rochefort had died 9 years earlier, in 1976. There is something almost too neat about that gap. 9 years, the precision of it, the way it removes any possibility that the timing was an accident or a coincidence. The institution waited long enough that the man who had been wronged couldn't stand in a room and receive what he was owed. Whether this was deliberate or simply bureaucratic is a distinction without a real difference. The result is the same. He never knew it was coming. What Nimitz had understood about Rochefort, the thing that made him override Washington and position his carriers at Point Luck, was a specific and transferable truth about the relationship between intelligence and institutions. Washington had been asking where the Japanese fleet was, how many carriers, what was the range of their strike package. This was the language the institution had built itself to speak, and it spoke it well. The Redmans were not incompetent. Their order of battle analysis was professionally conducted. In any situation where knowing where the enemy's assets were was the relevant question, they would have given a reliable answer. Rochefort was asking what the enemy intended, where they were going, when they would arrive, what they expected to find when they got there. This is a different question. It requires a different kind of reading, not inventory, but inference, not counting, but interpretation. It requires spending months inside the enemy's communications until the patterns become legible the way a language becomes legible, not word by word, but as something absorbed, something that starts producing meaning before you've consciously traced the mechanism. This skill cannot be organized into a formal reporting structure. It cannot be reviewed by committee. It cannot be made to produce consensus, because consensus is the average of multiple readings, and Rochefort's reading was not average. It was singular, specific, arrived at through months of work that nobody else in the chain had done. Washington's framework had no category for it. So it filed Rochefort under the nearest available category: difficult, outside the chain, insufficiently deferential to institutional authority, and processed him accordingly. Nimitz had seen this mechanism clearly enough to override it. Once. The institution made sure it would not have to override it again. Layton finished, and I was there, the year he died, 1984. He didn't live to see it published. His wife brought it out in '85, the same year the posthumous medal arrived. Two things returning to the record at the same moment, 43 years after the basement, after the AF Gambit, after June 4th. There are people for whom the posthumous medal represents something: closure, belated justice, an institution correcting itself. This is a generous reading, and perhaps a necessary one. The less generous reading is this: Rochefort spent the spring of '42 reading the enemy's intentions from fragments in a cold basement, proved his reading correct through one of the neatest pieces of intelligence work the Pacific War produced, watched Nimitz act on it, watched the ambush work, and then watched the institution spend the next 4 decades deciding whether any of that had happened in a way that required acknowledgement. They eventually decided it had. He wasn't there. In the spring of '42, Japan planned a battle against an enemy they had counted carefully. They knew how many carriers Nimitz had. They knew the condition of Yorktown. They knew the ranges, the armaments, the order of battle. They had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic said the outcome was settled. What they had not counted, what their intelligence apparatus had no mechanism to measure, was a man in a red smoking jacket reading their mail in a basement at Pearl Harbor, asking not where their fleet was, but where it was going. Washington had spent the spring counting the same things Japan counted. Rochefort had spent it reading what neither of them could see. The Navy gave him a floating dry dock for that. The medal came later, after he was gone, signed by a president who had been a film actor when the battle happened. Some debts an institution acknowledges, others it waits out. One question for the comments. If Nimitz had listened to Washington, if he had positioned his fleet to defend Hawaii instead of ambushing at Midway, what changes? The timeline? The cost? Something else? Leave it below. I read every one.